Okay, as it began to kind of tell you, on Saturday, October 27th, early that morning, President Kennedy received a news bulletin from the Soviet Union from Premier Khrushchev that was much different than the first letter he had received, we talked about yesterday, that stated they would be willing to remove missiles and missile sites if we would promise not to invade Cuba, lift our quarantine line. Well, this second letter he gets shortly afterwards is much different, and it says that the Soviet Union would only remove their missiles and missile construction sites in Cuba if the United States did what? Took our missiles out from Turkey. And that all originated probably from what? Their thought process came from what? That leak that the Kennedy brothers gave to Walter Lippmann. Now, President Kennedy and his advisors were horrified about this second letter, wondering how he could change his mind in just 12 hours. Now, if you think about this a little bit, what may have happened in Russia that would make Khrushchev change his mind in such a short period of time? Close. Not his advisors. Who found out? The military. And they got upset with his willingness to give up so easy, so they were afraid that there was a military coup in Russia. They were afraid that the Russian military had overthrown Khrushchev, and now this second letter comes really in their words, not in Khrushchev's. So ex-coms thinking there might have been a military coup in the Soviet Union, that Khrushchev had been overthrown. So if the military was giving this ultimatum, it provided an entirely new scenario if Khrushchev is not in charge. They really don't know who they're dealing with. Well, as Kennedy receives this new letter from Khrushchev, which is of great concern, he receives more information that might force him to order these airstrikes after all. So all this stuff is continuing. And he's getting this new letter from supposedly Khrushchev that states that now they'll only take out their missiles and missile launching pads if we take out our missiles in Turkey. So they're worried about a military coup. On top of that, President Kennedy gets more information, and this new information might force him to do the airstrike scenario anyway. The first bit of information he received on Saturday, October 27th, is that Soviets had implemented a crash program in Cuba. They had initiated a crash program in Cuba. What do you think that means, Pete? If they put together a crash program to do what? What do you think? What do you say? Well, to get the missiles operational. Remember, they're making these launching pads. All of a sudden now they've instituted a crash program. They're double timing. They're trying to get these missile launching pads operational as fast as they can. Not good news. The second bit of information that President Kennedy received that day is the new spy photos. They had continued this air surveillance, had confirmed that some of the missiles were already operational, and within 36 hours, all the others will be. So he receives this information that some of the missiles are already operational, and it's estimated by these spy plane photos and the analysis of those that within 36 hours from then, every missile on the island of Cuba would be launch ready. And the third piece of information that he had received is the Soviet Union had deployed battlefield nuclear weapons to Cuba. They had deployed battlefield nuclear weapons to Cuba. Now, if they deployed them, what's that mean? They're getting shipped out. They're not there yet. Now, they called these battlefield nuclear weapons frogs. That's what they referred to these Soviet battlefield nuclear weapons as frogs. And why are they sending them there? What's their purpose? To be used on what? What's that? Very good. On American troops if we come in after the airstrike. So they're not brought in there to try to eliminate any airstrikes the Americans might throw out. They're going to be used on any soldiers or any American troops when invasion occurs. So they're getting prepared. Well, now that some of these missiles are operational and the next ones will be operational within 36 hours, Kennedy's getting tremendous pressure from the military. And General Curtis LeMay warns the president by saying, quote, the longer we wait, the harder it's going to get. And he's pushing for what? What's he pushing for? Airstrikes. That we cannot negotiate this any longer. Everything's going to be operational in 36 hours. We got to go. The longer we wait, the harder it is to get. Well, Kennedy listens, and he does approve the following in preparation for a problem. We're in tough shape now again. And so Kennedy approves the following. First of all, he issues pre-invasion orders to American military forces. And pre-invasion orders means we're going to be totally prepared at a second's notice to hit the ground in Cuba with American troops. Okay? What's going to happen before that, Howard? Before he put troops in there? Airstrikes, okay? But he does order pre-invasion orders. In other words, military forces are going to be ready to roll at a second's notice. As soon as the decision's made, they're on the ground in Cuba. Second thing he did, because of the 36-hour window of operational missiles, is Kennedy ordered General Maxwell Taylor to go ahead and prepare the military to execute the airstrikes, and they are going in Monday morning, October 29th. They are going in Monday morning. So he authorizes Maxwell Taylor to prepare the military to execute those airstrikes the morning of October 29th. Remember, today is Saturday, October 27th. Okay? So he orders General Maxwell Taylor to prepare the military. They will execute the airstrikes the morning of Monday, October 29th. The third thing he does is he approves some more lower mid-level spy photographs to be taken. Not the on-the-deck ones, but not the ones way up here either, the ones kind of in the middle. Why do they need further U-2 flight missions? Because they've got to finalize the pilots' targets for when they go in on Monday, where they're going to hit. They're going to paint the targets, so to speak. So the third thing Kennedy does is he agrees to allow further U-2 flight missions so they can finalize the pilots' target folders for the airstrikes on Monday morning. They know what they're going to hit. Well, what's the concern with this new U-2 flight? They're going to get shot at. And if they get shot at, they're going to be protected. If they're protected, here we go. So, again, Kenneth O'Donnell gets on the telephone to talk to a pilot. The pilot he will visit with this time is Major Rudolph Anderson. Major Rudolph Anderson will be flying this final U-2 flight to target the airstrike points for Monday. So O'Donnell calls Major Rudolph Anderson. He's the one that's going to schedule this higher level reconnaissance. Again, it's not on the deck, but certainly within range of being shot down. I just want you to listen to the conversation that O'Donnell has with Anderson. He says, Major, my name is Kenneth O'Donnell, Special Assistant to the President. Major, a few days ago, the President ordered me to help him keep control of what is going on out there. I have been browbeating pilots and Navy guys left and right to make sure you don't get us here in Washington into trouble. But you know what? We're pretty damn good ourselves at getting into trouble, so instead of riding your ass, I'm just going to tell you what's going on here and let you figure out how to best help us out. A lot of things are going wrong today, and it's making everyone nervous. The more things go wrong, people will become more nervous, and it will be very hard to avoid war. Well, Anderson's really not very sure what O'Donnell's getting to, so he asks him, what exactly do you want of me? And his response, don't get shot down. Well, after further conversation with Major Anderson, O'Donnell asked the pilot, are you a religious man? And when Anderson stated to O'Donnell that he was a religious man, O'Donnell simply said, good. Unfortunately, soon afterwards, news was received that Major Anderson's plane was shot down over Cuba, killing the pilot. And as a result, Major Rudolph Anderson becomes the first and only combat fatality of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He is shot down. Okay, I want to read the story of Rudolph Anderson Jr. And again, I just want you to listen. This is from a different perspective. On October 27, 1962, Rudolph Anderson Jr. streaked through the stratosphere, 14 miles above a planet tied up in knots. Anderson was not originally scheduled to fly on this day, but he lobbied hard for the assignment when the mission was added to the schedule. This mission would be the most dangerous yet, with Soviet SA-2 surface-to-air missiles, also known as SAMs, now operational and war seemed imminent. Shortly after Anderson entered Cuban airspace, his unarmed high-altitude U-2 spy plane appeared as a blip on Soviet radar. As the Soviet military tracked the intruding aircraft, their concern mounted that the pilot was photographing secret locations of tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba. They already had some frogs in there earlier. They were sending more, but they didn't want to know they had them in there now. Soviet Lieutenant General Stefan Greko was quoted as saying, quote, our guest has been up there over an hour. I think we should give the order to shoot it down as it is discovering our positions in depth. The only man authorized to order a surface-to-air missile or SAM launch was a Soviet commanding general. At this point in the crisis, the man was nowhere to be found. As a result, Greko gave the order himself. Quote, destroy target number 33. 2 surface-to-air missiles rocketed into the sky toward Major Anderson's plane. One exploded near the U-2, shrapnel piercing the cockpit along with Anderson's pressurized flight suit and helmet, likely killing him instantly. The U-2 plunged 72,000 feet to the surface of Cuba. Within hours, word of Anderson's death reached the White House cabinet room. Military leaders overwhelmingly urged Kennedy to launch airstrikes against Cuba's air defenses the following morning, which would have been what day? 28 on Sunday, right? When Kennedy learned that the 35-year-old Anderson had a wife and 2 sons, ages 3 and 5, it struck home as his son, John Jr., was about the same age as Major Anderson's youngest son. In a letter that President Kennedy later wrote to Major Anderson's widow, 2 months pregnant with a baby girl, he stated, quote, your husband's mission was of the greatest importance, but I know how deeply you must feel his loss. Major Rudolph Anderson became the first ever recipient of the Air Force Cross after death, the service's highest designation short of the Medal of Honor. Memories of Rudolph Anderson may have faded, but he's not forgotten in his hometown of Greenville, North Carolina, where he built model planes as a young boy and chose good humor is the clear blue sky of the soul. In his high school yearbook, quote, on the 50th anniversary of his death, the city of Greenville, in conjunction with Furman University and the Upcountry History Museum, will unveil the redesigned Major Rudolph Anderson Jr. Memorial, which was originally installed in 1963. 13 engraved granite slabs embedded in the lawn describe each day of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and surrounding an F-86 Sabre jet similar to one flown by Anderson are text panels describing his boyhood, his distinguished military career, and his lasting legacy of contributing to the peaceful resolution of the crisis. Historians sum up the death of Major Rudolph Anderson as follows, quote, Anderson's death escalated the crisis significantly. It could have provoked a cascading series of events leading to a nuclear World War III. Instead, his death was a jolt to Kennedy and Khrushchev, and pushed the crisis to a point where they had to make a clear path, one of negotiation. Now we'll continue. Well, after Anderson was shot down, the military insisted on an immediate airstrike on the sites that fired at Major Anderson's plane per the rules of engagement. And although he was under tremendous pressure, Kennedy refused to buckle under the pressure. He wanted confirmation that the launch by Cuba that killed the American pilot was not an accident. He knew it wasn't an accident, but what was he doing? Buying time. Very good. General LeMay actually stepped up and bailed President Kennedy out of this tense situation. And General LeMay agreed with the president and stated that the military could wait until Monday to attack. It actually would be safer for his pilots. So even though LeMay was kind of a pain in his rear and pushed him, he's the one that bailed him out when it was really tense on that particular day and said he could wait till Monday. Well, what President Kennedy kids and XCOM have to do is they had 36 hours to try to provide a solution to this crisis other than what? Airstrikes and invasion, which will lead to war with the Soviet Union. Well, a weary Kenneth O'Donnell left the White House and decided he would go watch his son play in a football game. And during the game, there was a little bit of a break, and his son asked him if everything was going to be okay, and his father stated that everything would be fine. Well, when Kenny Jr. asked his father if he was coming home that night, he simply couldn't find the emotion to answer him and told him to go back to his game. So he took off. He had just, the pressure was so enormous, he just took off and had to get out of there and went to watch his son play a football game. Well, what do you think happened while O'Donnell was gone? What did XCOM decide they might want to do? Negotiate. And they kind of pointed towards making a deal with the Soviets for what? What are we going to give them? The missiles in Turkey. Okay? So while O'Donnell was gone, further discussion on XCOM pointed towards the possibility of making a deal with the Soviets for the removals of our missiles in Turkey. Well, O'Donnell and Bobby kind of got into a confrontation when he got back, because when Bobby told him the news of a possible trade, O'Donnell got upset, believing that this trade would simply lead to trade after trade after trade, and what would the Soviet Union eventually want us to trade? That we promised we would always defend. West Berlin. And that's what O'Donnell says, you can't make this trade for these missiles, then they're going to want to add this, and then we're going to add this, and pretty soon they're going to add something we can't live with, and that's Berlin. So O'Donnell became agitated at the news, believing that agreeing to this trade would start a series of trade demands by the Soviet Union, and eventually one of these trade demands would be one we couldn't live with, a trade for West Berlin. Well, then O'Donnell got back on Bobby about the trade scenario came from this leak that he and the president gave to Walter Lippmann. They were kind of getting after each other a little bit. And O'Donnell pointed out that since the leak came after the first letter was sent, Khrushchev knew they would trade missiles in Turkey, just like we talked about. Does that make sense? Well, we have just 28 hours now before airstrikes in Cuba, and XCOM's going to have to make a decision. XCOM made the decision against trading missiles for missiles. Well, they decided what to do about these two letters. How should we respond? Because they really didn't respond to either letter, right? They received the first one stating they would remove missiles and missile launching pads in exchange for a no invasion pledge of Cuba and lifting the quarantine zone. Then the next one, of course, wanted the missiles in Turkey. Well, what they decided to do is they would just agree to the conditions of Khrushchev's first letter. They're just going to agree to that. They're going to respond back, yeah, we'll take that deal. You'll remove your missiles in Cuba and your missile launching pads. We will promise not to invade Cuba, and we will lift the quarantine zone. However, these missiles in Cuba will be inspected by UN inspectors. They're just going to respond to that. They're not going to respond to the other one, okay? And they're hoping that'll work. Well, President Kennedy excuses XCOM, and who does he meet with? Just privately with his own and his closest advisors. So he kind of kicks the ones that he thinks maybe he doesn't want to hear this next discussion out. Now, basically what this small group does is they decided to make a private offer to Premier Khrushchev, and the offer would be to remove American missiles in Turkey in exchange for the missiles being removed in Cuba. Now, by making this offer, what would they find out about Khrushchev? If they make this offer, what do they find out privately? Whether or not it's Khrushchev or the military. They find out who's still in control. Okay? So if you think about this, if the Soviet Union was running the country, they would not agree to this private assurance, which would result in airstrikes followed by full-scale invasion of Cuba on Monday morning. If the Soviet Union agreed to the private assurance, the trade, then the United States would know that Khrushchev is still in control. Because what does the Russian military want to do? They don't want to negotiate, do they? Just like ours doesn't. So they say, well, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to offer this private assurance. And we're going to offer that to Khrushchev. Now, how are they going to do that? They're going to fly over to Russia? They're going to use Anatoly Dobrynin, the highest ranking Soviet diplomat in the United States. We talked about him already. He was the guy that was informed by Dean Rusk at 6 o'clock just before the president made his speech to the American people about what was going on. Now, is President Kennedy going to meet with him? Because that gives him deniability. I didn't offer missiles in Turkey. Are you kidding me? So who's he going to send to negotiate? He's going to send him for support.